This man is being badly beaten. Witness 6 is a Catholic Albanian civilian who was abducted on Friday, the 13th of June 1998, whilst he and his family were driving in his Mercedes-Benz 200 vehicle along the Jakova-Klina road. He'd left home about 11:30 that morning to go to Klina. He and his family had passed through Grabanica and been turned back at the entrance to Dolovo by Serb soldiers. But on the way back to Jakova, he was stopped again along the main road at a place between Jakova and Klina by approximately 10 KLA soldiers wearing a mix of camouflage and civilian clothes. His car was searched. He was detained at the roadside for about 2 hours with his family. He had a pistol on him, which was seized together with documents. This is the evidence he gave. He says he had a license for the pistol, but it was a police-issue weapon and issued to reserve police. It had in fact been his father's. He also had on his person a photograph of himself with a retired Albanian policeman in police uniform. After about 2 hours of his detention at the side of the road, another car came along the road. The soldiers fired some shots and then brought the car to near where he was. It was a light blue Opel Kadett with Jakova license plates beginning DJ. Soldiers asked him if he recognized the car, but he said he didn't. Shortly after this, about 20 minutes later, Witness 6 and his family were taken in the two vehicles, the Kadett and the Mercedes, towards Jablanica. He was in the Kadett with his wife, and a soldier and the children were in the Mercedes. Inside the Kadett, he saw some photographs. They were of a policeman who worked in Jakova, whom he knew as Nenad. Nenad was from the Binks village in Klina municipality and worked in Jakova. Witness 6 believed Nenad was a Serb or a Montenegrin who worked as a policeman. Your Honours, this man, this Nenad, the prosecution says, is Nenad Ristar. He was the owner of a light blue Opel Kadett, was a Serbian traffic police officer, and he is the victim of count 4 in this indictment. It's our case that he was abducted at the time the Kadett was stopped on the road on the 13th of June 1998. He'd left his home travelling to work at about 1:30 in the afternoon. He'd gone in the blue Kadett, and he is described as having short, light brown to blonde hair. There is significance of this. Blue eyes and clean shaven. He never returned home from his trip to work that day. Has never been heard from or seen since. His body has not been recovered. Returning to Witness 6, on the way to Jablanica, now travelling, they stopped in a convoy in Nepali village where his wife and children were told to get out. He wasn't allowed to leave, and they travelled on to Jablanica. They arrived at Jablanica, and he was taken into the compound, to a room close to the entrance to the compound of the building the prosecution describes as the prison. He says he was initially taken to a single-storey house with red bricks and 4 rooms in the middle of the courtyard. And he identified this photograph, showing, I hope now, as the 4-room house. Your Honours can see it's the same photographs, part at least of the same photographs you've been looking at, and the man kneeling in the corner there. He went on to describe the basement and said there was water in the basement, and he was held in the building for 6 weeks, being released on the 25th of July 1998. Once he was taken into the building, he was placed in one of the rooms and beaten by soldiers until he describes them being exhausted. He says one after the other, sometimes with a baseball bat, sometimes with other things, whatever they could lay their hands on. It's part of his testimony. During the 6 weeks he was there, he was beaten often. One of the beaters was Lahi Brahimi, known as Maxhup. The others were Nazmi Brahimi, Lahi's brother, and his cousin, Hamza. They were the initiators of the beatings. But on the first day and night of his detention, he was kept in a building different from the four-room building. He was kept there with a man called Nenad he had seen in the photographs in the car. And he drew on a photograph, which I think is being shown now, in the last trial, the room in which he was initially kept that first night. Photograph 65 to 00333. And you always can see it's in the long building as the entrance to the compound. It was here, he says, that Nazmi Brahimi beat him until he, the victim, lost consciousness. He was beaten with a baseball bat on his legs and his arms. He was tied with rope to Nenad in the same room. They were both beaten. He said, "We stayed there all night and we were beaten and tortured and we had lost consciousness, me and Nenad." Nazmi and a group of soldiers took turns to beat them, Nazmi Brahimi. He was with Nenad, he says, for 24 hours, and then Nenad was taken away by two soldiers. When he was taken away, Nenad, wasn't able to walk. He said they both had, he and Nenad, the same injuries. They were both moved after the first night to the four-room building. Witness 6 was kept in the room on the left side of the building as you enter. He was not kept with Nenad. He didn't see him again, and he didn't know what happened to him. Prosecution says the account of what happened to Nenad Ristar is picked up by witness 81. I'll return to witness 6 to deal with Nenad Ristar. Witness 81 describes returning to Jablanica about 3 weeks after the ear-cutting incident. This would appear to fit, prosecution says, with the abduction of Nenad Ristar on the 13th of June 1998. He describes, witness 81, being sent to the prison at Jablanica in order to take 2 Roma and an Albanian prisoner to Novo Selo, where there was another KLA prison. He had an order to take to Lahi Brahimi, which he delivered. He saw the 3 prisoners who he had to take and said they were not too badly beaten. He said there were a total of about 15 prisoners and was present when Lahi Brahimi interrogated and beat a policeman called Nenad, who had blonde, fair hair. He was questioned about patrols and checkpoints. His hands were tied behind his back, and he was beaten by Lahi Brahimi all over his body with a baseball bat. He was already hardly able to stand, he says, before this interrogation. Witness 81 took his 3 prisoners away to Novo Selo, returned to Jablanica the next day. He'd gone to take 3 prisoners to another place and had become somehow involved in the interrogation of this witness, of this victim. He returned the next day to discover that this victim, Nenad Ristar, and 2 other Serb policemen, he said, who were also detained in the basement, and all the other prisoners had gone. He did not ask Makshuk, the prisoners in the basement had gone. He didn't ask them what had happened, but understood, he says, they had all been killed. He doesn't explain any more about that. Returning to witness 6, he wasn't kept in the basement, he was kept in the rooms. He said for the first 4 weeks he was kept locked in the room on the left-hand side of the building and saw no one other than those that came, he says, to torture him. He couldn't tell day from night because he was locked in the room and beaten. Wasn't allowed out, and the window was barred with wooden planks. He was given a piece of bread and marmalade, a little to drink, filthy water in glass jars. He was sick and he was often unconscious. They took his watch and he was almost naked. He couldn't count the assailants because they were numerous. This is his evidence. For the second 2 weeks he had more freedom to move and had better food and was able to eat bread and beans. And after about 2 weeks of his detention they brought 4 other prisoners, he said, a Bosnian and 3 Montenegrins. It's clear, it's fair to say that this witness is a little unclear about precisely the periods of time between the 6 weeks for how long he was kept whether it was 2 or 4 weeks before he was allowed a little bit more freedom. But Your Honours will no doubt be able to deal with that when you read and understand his testimony. But essentially he gives an account of increasing amounts of freedom. And then describing during this detention period, these 4 other prisoners, a Bosnian and 3 Montenegrins, are the other victims account for. The Bosnian was a Muslim working in Detention in the Electro-Kosovo company. The 4 were together with witness 6, the 4 new people, Bosnian and 3 Montenegrins, were with witness 6 for about 3 days, he says. He describes how the 4 men were beaten during the 3 days they were there. They were beaten with baseball bats, they were stabbed with knives, their clothes were covered in blood. He describes the victims being pricked with knives all over their bodies, about 1 centimetre deep, 3 of them. They were bleeding, and because of the beating, they spat blood. They were covered in blood. That's his testimony. There was blood on the floor. He says that during the beatings, Nazmi, Brahimi and Hamza were there. On about 10 o'clock in the evening on the 3rd day, the 4 men were taken away. He never saw them again. During the beating of the man from Electro-Kosovo, the soldiers were telling him, "You're working for Serbia, you're working for Electro-Kosovo, and you are interrupting the power supply." All the time the KLA soldiers were beating him. Throughout the time he was detained there, witness 6 saw Lahi Brahimi continuously, regularly. Asked what this meant, he said, well, 2 days would not pass without seeing Lahi Brahimi there. That was his testimony. He went on to describe the three men coming to beat him regularly with baseball bats and fists. He said, for 2 weeks I didn't know where my face was, where my neck was. I was all swollen up because of the beatings. They also sent others to beat him. All 3, Lahi Brahimi, Nazmi Brahimi and Hamza Brahimi, weren't there all together at the same time. And asked about his conditions of detention, he said, during my stay for the first 3 weeks, there was nothing in the room, only the floor, no covering, no blankets, nothing. About 2 weeks before he was released, he had a little bit more freedom. It appears he could move around this time in the village a little. 3 other people were brought in at that time. One was an Albanian man from Zahac, brought in the boot of a car, in a metallic Mercedes. And he was beaten, the prosecution says, and tortured until he died. When he arrived, the man in the car, they took him from the trunk of the car and beat him, they being Nazmi Brahimi, Lahi Brahimi and others. He says he was ultimately sent for treatment, or the man was ultimately sent for treatment, but he died. That man was kept in a room different from witness 6 and was beaten by Nazmi and Hamza. The prosecution says that man, the man in the Mercedes from Zahac, was Cuchi, victim in count 5. Later again, they brought 2 other prisoners. One was Pal Krasniqi, another victim in count 5. He was wearing sports clothes, a blue tracksuit, and witness 6 was shown a photograph of Pal Krasniqi and was able to identify the man as one of the men who was brought in. He said Pal Krasniqi was a Catholic. The other man, who came a few hours after Pal Krasniqi, is, the prosecution says, witness 3, another victim of count 5. These 2 men, Pal Krasniqi, witness 3, and Cuchi, were put together in one room. He, witness 6, says he saw Pal Krasniqi and the other man, Cuchi, being beaten with a baseball bat. Describes them being in a horrifying state. He didn't see witness 3 being beaten. Pal Krasniqi and the other man, Cuchi, were beaten continuously on the 2nd day of their detention. Witness 6 goes on to describe how the three, he says, tried to escape. He says witness 3 was able to get away, but the other two could not. They couldn't walk fast. They were recaptured, beaten and tortured again. Hamza Brahimi beat them. Skender Cuchi was later taken to Iznik, but Pal Krasniqi was left in Jablanica. In the time the other man, Skender Cuchi, was there, Witness 6 describes him as lying down with his eyes closed. He said he was fat and also swollen because of the beating. So his eye, he could not open his eyes. He was all swollen. He was fat, but because of the beating, he said, quote, I thought his clothes could not contain his body because of the swelling. That's at transcript 5337 of the last trial. Witness 6 described Pal Krasniqi as beaten up very badly. He could not eat or drink anything. Witness 6 remembers being released on the 25th of July 1998. He saw Pal Krasniqi shortly before he left Jablanica and says this: there was blood on him, he was spitting blood, his body was all blue and black because of the beating, swollen. He was lying down on the floor. I would bring him some water. He was in this shape for a week. Then I was released and left that place, and I don't know what happened to him. He never saw him again, and he didn't know why he'd been imprisoned. Your Honours, Pal Krasniqi's body was recovered from the Lake Radonich Canal by Serb investigators on or around the 8th of September 1998. It's the body labelled R9. An autopsy revealed that the cause of death was multiple gunshot injuries to the head, trunk and upper limbs. Witness 6 was never given any reason as to why he himself had been imprisoned. But it's clear, Your Honours, from the transcript in the last trial, in answers to questions, I think, by Mr. Harvey in cross-examination, that he was being beaten, and when he was being beaten, he was being questioned. And during the questioning, he was asked whether he had stayed in the company of Serbs. He said, they accused me of staying with Serbs. Asked further about that, he said, Lahi and Nazmi were saying this. Lahi and Nazmi accused me of staying with Serbs. In answers to Judge Ori during the transcript, he said, that night when we arrived there, they asked such questions. They continued to torture me, and then the soldiers came and told me, you are a spy of Serbia. As a Catholic Albanian, he explained he was not, he felt, considered an Albanian, he said, for them. And even now they do not consider me an Albanian. When he was released, he was given some papers stating that the staff of the subzone of Dukagene had ordered his car and revolver be confiscated, signed by Nazmi Brahimi as deputy commander. And in addition, he had a paper saying that he, the accused, was being conditionally released by the staff of the subzone, and that if he were to repeat his, in inverted commas, mistakes, he would be prosecuted. He said he didn't know what his mistakes were. He confirmed that Lahi Brahimi and his brother mistreated him continuously. Indeed, the trial chamber found, beyond reasonable doubt, that Lahi Brahimi personally participated in the torture and cruel treatment of Witness 6 and convicted him of the crimes of torture and cruel treatment as violations of the laws and customs of war.
Your Honour, I should just give notice at this point that the defence for Lahi Brahimi objects to the use of any reference to convictions. As Your Honour has said repeatedly, this is a trial de novo, and if the issue of conviction is sought to be relied on by the prosecution in any degree, then we wish to brief that because we believe it to be completely contrary to the jurisprudence of this tribunal.
Your Honour, I had indicated to Mr. Harvey in advance of today's hearing that I intended to open his convictions, and unfortunately he hadn't mentioned this to me before I did. I shan't mention it. I think it's a matter of record in any event that they exist, but we can deal with what the evidential value of them is or may be in due course. I take note of what he says, that there is an issue.
Thank you for taking note, and thank you. Are you done? Yes, Mr. Harvey?
I just want to clarify that I thought I had made it abundantly clear to Mr. Rogers that I would take this position. I'm surprised if he is surprised, that's all.
Thank you, Mr. Harvey.
All right, I'll carry on. Your Honours, by the 25th of July 1998, and after Ramesh Haradinaj's appointment as commander on the 23rd of June 1998, the Dukajin zone had been organised with Ramesh Haradinaj as the commander. Lahi Brahimi was appointed his deputy initially, but by the 25th of July 1998, Ramesh Haradinaj had replaced him with Nazmi Brahimi, which may go some way to explain how the papers that Witness 6 relieved were signed by Nazmi Brahimi as deputy commander. Your Honour, the witness, after his suffered the attacks that he had, says that he continues to have trouble with his left arm and with pain in his kidneys. Whereas I just turn to deal a little more now with Skender Cuchi, Pal Krasniqi and Witness 3. Witness 3 was a member of a political party, the LDK, which was a political party supporting Ibrahim Rugova, leader of the LDK, and whose ideal had very broadly, and I don't want to get into an entire political history, but very broadly had been for a peaceful path, in inverted commas, solution to the situation in Kosovo. Witness 3 had been a village guard in Grabanica and was at that time in position when the Serbs attacked the village, going back now into the 19th of May 1998. On the 21st of May, he had to withdraw from the village to Jablanica, passing through Glojan, and on the way he met Lahi Brahimi, who was very angry, he says, and Alush Agushi, who accused him of being a traitor for abandoning his post. In his testimony in the Limai trial, Shevchet Kabashi described how the villagers of Grabanica had fled the shelling to Glojan, Catholic Glojan. He described how the leaders, who he said were Lahi Brahimi and Alush Agushi, who is another KLA member and a JCE, named JCE member, asked the villagers of Grabanica why they had left, why they had fled. And he then said this in his transcript: at that time it was very difficult to leave your place. Asked what he meant by this, he said, because the time was very difficult, and it was difficult to leave your place, of course. It was better to stay there and get killed than to flee. Witness 3 stayed for about a week in Jablanica. He moved around a bit. He stayed for about a week in Jablanica until the 31st of May, when he went to stay in a house in Jabal belonging to a man called Tal Zeka. Can I just very briefly go into private session and then very quickly out again?
May the chamber please move into private session?
Back in open session.
Thank you so much, Madam Registrar. Yes, Mr. Rogers.
Thank you, Your Honour. Another man was also in Tal Zeka's house. He too had been forced to leave Grabanica on the 21st of May in the Serb attack. But KLA soldiers came for that other man, and the other man was forced to leave there by the KLA soldiers, who kicked and beat him, witnessed by Witness 3. He was taken away with someone called Fadil Fazliu. One of the KLA members that took him away was called Oiku, or Pieter Shala was his name, also known as Oiku. He was, prosecution says, a member of the MP of the KLA and a member of the JCE. He wore a black uniform was shouting abuse at the other man and Fazliu as they were taken downstairs, all the time calling them traitors. Lahi Brahimi began looking for witness 3, the prosecution says, around the 30th of June 1998. Lahi appeared at Talzeka's house, where witness 3 was, and asked witness 3 to go with him to Jablanica. The car being driven by Lahi Brahimi was a Mercedes car that it is said belonged to Skender Cuchi. Lahi took witness 3 to what he called what witness 3 called the staff headquarters in Jablanica, where there was a prison. He was shown this photograph and identified this as the place where he had been taken, and so perhaps it's not offensive to call it Jablanica prison on this one, because this is the witness identified as the prison he was taken to. He said he was kept prisoner in the building on the right-hand side in the photograph, consistent with the...
We have no pictures.
Oh, I'm sorry. No
Thank
picture. Picture. You have vision. Oh, no, thank you. He says he was in the building on the right-hand side in the photograph. After he was taken there...
Yes, Mr. Harvey.
I'm sorry, lest silence be thought to be consent, it is still objectionable, Your Honours. I hate to interrupt, but it really is no good keeping on plugging away with labels that should never have been on photographs in the first place.
I hear what is said. Your Honours, the witness described being detained in that building on the right-hand side, where he was put into a room. Other people came in and they beat him. There were 2 other people there. One was called Skender Cuchi. Witness 3 was beaten with baseball bats until he lost consciousness. He says he was detained 2 nights and 3 days, but was himself only beaten on the first day. He had his hands tied at night, as did the other 2 men. He said Nazmi Brahimi was one of his attackers. He kicked him. The others beat Skender Cuchi and the other man. They were terribly injured, the 2 other men. He said Skender was black on one side, the other man was swollen. Skender Cuchi was crying in pain and moaning, but the other could not move. He further described the condition of the other man, who the prosecution says is Pal Krasniqi, as follows, quote, "He was beaten to a pulp. He was not in a position to get up, let alone walk in the courtyard. He used to pee in his pants," end quote. At one point, witness 3 describes being taken into a room next to the one he was beaten in. There he appeared before Lahi Brahimi, who accused him of supporting the Serb police. There were 2 women in the room as well. Lahi told them to practice on him, and the women started to beat him as hard as they could with what he described as a kind of telescope on his hands. This lasted 5 or 10 minutes. Lahi, he said, had a revolver, which he said to witness 3 he should use to kill himself. Another man in the room told witness 3 to admit everything. He said, "I'll cut your throat and then you'll have to admit everything." Witness 3 decided that at that point it was time to run away. When he returned to the room where the other 2 were, he decided he was going to run away. He escaped through a side window and did not see Skender Cuchi or the other man, Pal Krasniqi, again. You should have a photograph, I hope. No? Yes? I'm grateful. Which the witness marked during the course of the last trial. And he marked 2 rooms. One on the right, he said, was the room that he escaped from, and is marked SK, together with Skender Cuchi. And the room on the left, marked L, is the room he says that he went into where Lahi Brahimi was, and where he was beaten on his hands. He ran out of the building towards what the prosecution says is a brook or a stream at the end of this compound area, and escaped. He said Skender Cuchi followed him, but he didn't make it. After his escape, sometime later, he saw Lahi Brahimi again. Lahi took him to his Lahi Brahimi's house and there accused him that Skender Cuchi had promised the witness 10,000 Deutschmarks to help him escape. Lahi slapped witness 3 around the face, forced him into the boot of the Mercedes car, and drove him to the staff headquarters. He describes the staff headquarters. Lahi drove him around in the trunk of the car and kicked him. And at some point, he stopped the car, opened the trunk, and carried out what the prosecution will describe as a mock execution. Lahi pulled out his gun and asked witness 3 if he should pull the trigger. Witness 3 said yes. Lahi fired. He saw a flame and heard a click and felt some pain but realized he had not been shot. Thank you. Lahi Brahimi shut the trunk and drove off to Glojan, to the home of Ramush Haradinaj. Your Honours, witness Kabashi also describes seeing Skender Cuchi and Pal Krasniqi at Jablanica in June or July 1998. In fact, around the 10th of July 1998, Pal Krasniqi had gone to Jablanica to join the KLA and worked for a few days before being arrested as a spy and detained in Jablanica prison. Cuchi's name had appeared on a list of wanted persons around the 12th of July 1998, which I mentioned earlier on, the list of wanted persons. Cuchi's brother had been a police officer. He was abducted, Cuchi, from his home in Zahach, also the home village of witness Kabashi, and taken to the Jablanica compound in his own Mercedes-Benz car, where he was detained and beaten. Kabashi saw Cuchi there, spoke to him, and was told that Cuchi had been accused of being a spy. He spoke to Lahi Brahimi about Cuchi, and Brahimi said that he, Cuchi, was a big fish, which Kabashi took to mean a Serb spy. Kabashi said it wasn't true, and that Lahi informed him he believed that Cuchi was working for the Serb Secret Service. He also, Kabashi, saw Krasniqi, Pal Krasniqi, looking very scared, somebody that he'd known, Pal Krasniqi, for a long time. And Krasniqi told him that he had admitted to being a spy under torture in order to make the torture stop. He said he'd gone to join the KLA in Jablanica, but after a few days he was accused of being a spy and imprisoned. Bashi was troubled, went home that night and talked to his family about the condition of the 2 men, who urged him to try to do something to save them. But when he returned the next day, Skender Cuchi was in a very bad way. His belly was bloated. He asked those imprisoning the men what had happened, and they said that Skender and a man from Grabanica had tried to escape. It appears, Your Honours, from the evidence that KLA Subzone Commander Rustam Tetay, who had involvement in what subsequently happened with Cuchi, became aware of the detention of Cuchi and informed Mr. Haradinaj, who together they went to Jablanica in order to seek the immediate release of Skender Cuchi. Haradinaj spoke to Nazmi Brahimi, according to Rustam Tetay, who responded that Cuchi had tried to escape and had been slightly injured, and that he would be released as soon as he recovered. Ramush Haradinaj ordered that he be taken to the hospital in Irznik. He was taken to the hospital, but died of his injuries. His body was buried initially near to the mosque and cemetery in Jablanica, and was ultimately exhumed and moved. An OMPF autopsy reveals records of multiple fractures to his body. Kabashi provides a little further information as to who were responsible for beatings generally. He said those that usually beat the prisoners were Lahi Brahimi, a man called Bandash, Pieta Shala, known as Oiku, Idris Balai, and 2 others, and he describes Mr. Balai as being the cruelest. He recounts a particular incident relating to another man called Yabushati. 2 protected witnesses will corroborate, the prosecution says, Mr. Kabashi's account, as they recount how, to some extent at least, as they account how Yabushati was detained at the Jablanica prison around the spring of 1998 and so severely mistreated while in detention that he could barely walk. He, like the other victims in this case, was detained and mistreated by the KLA at Jablanica on suspicion of being a Serb collaborator. And as I'm conscious of the time, I have 1 count left to deal with. Is this a convenient moment to break?
It is indeed, if it's convenient to you.
Yes.
We'll take a break and come back at quarter 10.
All rise. Very good.